Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to UNDP's series of development dialogues, Rethinking Solutions to Crisis in the Decade of Action. I want to also extend a special welcome to the head of the Crisis Bureau, ASG Asako Okai, who you will hear from a little bit later on, and our Deputy Director, Mr. George Conway, who are joining us for this very important conversation. I am Ronald Jackson. I'm the head of UNDP's Disaster Risk Reduction and Recovery team for building resilience, and I'm honored to be moderating this session. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this expert panel on evolving the concept and practice of risk-informed development. This 90-minute session, which we are conducting, will be in 3 parts. We'll start first by hearing from the Bureau's director with opening remarks, then move to presentations from our 5 expert panelists, after which we will have about 30 minutes of discussion time to hear from you, our participants, interacting with our key panelists. Please type any questions you may have for the panel into the Q&A function. In addition, you can also leave comments in the chat box function, which is visible to all. UNDP is using this dialogue series to rethink our approaches to fragility, risk, and crisis. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic impacted us, UNDP's disaster risk reduction team commenced a revisit on the relationship between development and calamities to bring a deeper understanding of risk to development and risk from development decisions. We recognize that there was a need for greater appreciation of the fact that risks are multidimensional and systemic, and that there was a need to evolve UNDP's traditional risk-informed development offer, which currently is couched in the disaster risk reduction and climate change lens, to better provide approaches that address this very real manifestation of the challenges the world faces today and will face tomorrow. Against this backdrop, this event will ponder the following questions. What are the key challenges and barriers to evolving a risk-informed development offer in support of a multidimensional risk approach? What are some of the successes, good practices, and who have led these initiatives? What should be scaled up and sustained? How can we create an enabling environment for the key building blocks for risk-informed development? That is, data analytics and foresight, sustainable financing, institutional ownership, and partnerships, including with the private sector. To answer some of these questions, we have gathered here today a distinguished panel, which I will introduce when it is their time to speak. I would now like to move to the first part of our dialogue, which is to invite opening remarks. And I have the pleasure to invite Ms. Asako Okai to deliver the opening remarks. Ms. Okai is the Assistant Secretary General and Director of UNDP's Crisis Bureau. She has over 30 years of service with UNDP and the Japanese Foreign Service. She has also served in the permanent mission of Japan to the UN and as a senior member of the Office of the President of the 66th UN General Assembly. ASG Okai, you have the floor.
Thank you, Don, and thank you for the introduction of myself. Colleagues, distinguished panelists and friends, a warm welcome to all from me too. And let me start by quoting one of our speakers from last week's Development Dialogue event on addressing urban resilience. He said, and then he will be on the panel this time today. He said, one of UNDP's greatest value addition is in the area of risk governance and understanding what the risks are and why and how they should be integrated into development plans, policies, and budget. Indeed, as Ron had said, we have decades of work in influencing governments to risk-inform public sector policy and investment. We have generated evidence from disasters and climate change-related loss, damage, and data, and provided risk and vulnerability assessment, as well as cost-benefit analysis of risk-informed investment. While we have had some successes, however, we still fall short of building long-term resilience to multiple shocks and crises. We had started to think about multidimensional and systematic risks even before the pandemic, And now we have no option but to accelerate our efforts and approaches in this direction. Reducing risks and building resilience in today's world needs to consider three things. First, the interconnectedness of systems. Second, the multidimensionality of risks beyond disaster and climate risks. And third, the underlying drivers of risks linked to poverty, inequalities, and weak governance. With this in mind, UNDP has embarked on evolving our work in risk-informed development to the next level, consulting with internal as well as external stakeholders through a global online platform. We started with what we knew and what we did well in the disaster risk management area, as Ron had put it, in an effort to charter ways toward where we need to go to make risk governance situated at the cross section of UNDP's governance, crisis prevention, resilience building, climate action, health, poverty, and many other practice areas. To this end, collaborating with our partners on the design and delivery of this offer will be essential. For example, the UN development system is moving towards making UN sustainable development cooperation frameworks more conflict sensitive and risk informed to foster resilient societies or to accelerate the delivery of national urban policies or to ensure that risk informed preparedness is integrated in budgeting and finance allocations. There's much that we have already learned, but we are not there yet. Today's event is aimed at identifying ways to push us further in our elaboration on the next generation risk-informed development offer. Our panelists today have been selected purposefully. They are all experts on disaster risk and crisis management, as well as on resilience building with decades of experience. They represent different organizations, government, intergovernmental, private sector, and multilateral that all struggle with the same question. How do we expand and evolve risk-informed development to include multidimensional risks that go beyond single hazard and siloed approach? The challenge of breaking out of our silos has proved to be a tough one so far. Let me give you my personal reflection. As a Japanese national, I am proud of Japan's centuries-long investment in disaster risk reduction. Japan has built a disaster-resilient infrastructure and significantly strengthened early warning systems, preparedness, and awareness of the public, championing a human security approach. However, in terms of risk governance in the face of today's complex crisis, I am not too sure that Japan has adequately managed to adapt the learning from disaster risk reduction to a new context. What are the knowledge, capacities, and capabilities needed to enable an integrated approach to deal with today's complex crisis? Nowadays, we need to take into account not only disaster, climate change, health considerations, but also fragility and economic and financial shocks, and sometimes conflict risks as well at the same time. How can we consolidate and make best use of tools and assets for data, analysis, horizon scanning, and early warning to risk-proof development decision-making? Can't we better leverage technologies and innovations for strategic foresight and future-proofing? And also the financing is another big issue because this will be a new frontier for many. How do we generate sustainable financing and engage ministers of finance and donors in the risk-informed development approach? I hope the perspectives we hear today will provide us with some ideas, approaches, and maybe even solutions toward this end. Thank you, and I really look forward to our exciting discussion today. Thank you. Over back to you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Asako. You left us with some very candid reflections, and I just want to pull out on some of these from your opening statement. You've quite pointedly indicated that we've fallen short to building resilience against multidimensional risk and crisis. And here you've singled out this issue around the interconnectedness of systems and understanding the underlying drivers. You pointed out that this is situated within risk governance, that we're situating risk governance at the crossroads of the practice within UNDP. Quite interesting. The cooperation framework provides an opportunity, the various cooperation frameworks that the UN is embarking on with governments as an opportunity for really driving this risk-informed development approach in a multi-sectoral way. You've asked us, how can we get beyond this siloed approach to dealing with this issue, moving away from a single hazard approach to looking at risk in all of its facets? And I particularly liked your honest reflection on the Japanese context, recognizing that globally Japan has been held up as a sort of the benchmark for how we've dealt with risk. Yet we recognize that there are opportunities to evolve that practice. And of course, you've raised some very important questions, which I'm pretty sure they will be unpacked in the second segment of our discussion today. Thank you again, ASG Okai, and I now turn to our expert panel. We have an esteemed set of experts lined up for you to hear from, and they will be giving their perspectives on the evolving paradigm of risk-informed development. As ASG Okai mentioned in our opening remarks, our panelists represent key organizational and thematic structures, which we feel will bring a lot of richness to discussion. In fact, one of the very important message, I think, behind the panelists is that here we have practitioners who've been operating within a specific domain, but who have now challenged themselves to move out of that comfort zone. And I think that's a very good message for this discussion we're going to be having today. We're pleased to have perspectives from a government lens, from a regional organization, regional intergovernmental organizational lens, a private sector lens, and from UNDP. You have colleagues who will be speaking up to 8 minutes each to present, and I humbly request that you do not go beyond that, because we really want to leave some time for the engagement with our participants, and also indeed amongst the panelists themselves. As you've been advised, you'll be alerted if you are coming close to your time. Our first speaker is Mr. Kamal Kishore. He is a member of India's National Disaster Management Authority since 2015, where he has worked on policy and planning and anchors the Prime Minister's initiative on the Global Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Prior to the NDMA, he worked with the United Nations, the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, and the TARU. This is a leading development advisory think tank for those who don't recognize the acronym. He has over 25 years of experience and has advised national governments in more than 10 countries on disaster management issues and supported post-disaster recovery after major disasters in South Asia. Kamal, it's always a pleasure to have you with us and to hear from you. My question to you this morning, please, can you share with us how the government of India is approaching the institutionalization of risk-informed development that considers a range of different types of risk and threats? What are some of the good practices you see emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic? Over to you, Kamal.
Thanks very much, Ron, and it's been a pleasure following the development dialogues of UNDP over the last few weeks. And among all the different development dialogues, I think the current one is amongst the weightiest one and the most complex. And you have really caught onto a wicked problem that the humanity is facing in the second decade or the third decade of the 21st century. So, so you asked me to give good practices or what is, I think it is too early to sort of give you good practices or what works. We are still grappling with it. So please allow me to highlight the challenges, and hopefully an articulation of challenges will give us a direction for what could be a good practice or what could be the directions. So let me put that in basically three buckets. My first set of comments is going to be about legislation and institutions, to do what the subject of this meeting is. The second is about risk language. And the third is about capacity and culture. So let me start with the first one, about legislation and institution. So those of us who come from the disaster risk management arena, we have been working with disasters emanating from natural hazards or man-made hazards. And for a long period of time, we have come to a conclusion. We have articulated what is called the subsidiarity principle, work at the local, work as close to the ground of action as possible, go local, the community-based disaster risk management or local level risk management. Now, when you begin to look at a whole basket of risks, I begin to wonder, whether that still holds true, because at the local level, there may be blind spots to risks that are being generated elsewhere, but are affecting the local level. So who actually, if we have to talk about a comprehensive risk-informed approach to development, who maintains the register of that risk? Who actually assigns different weights to different kinds of risks? Does it still happen at the local level, or it happens at the national level? So once again, it begins to bring to fore the tension between the central and the local. It would be very interesting to see how this tension resolves itself in the legislative reform, which inevitably will begin to take place after the pandemic in countries, because there is a huge tendency to centralize, because there are things which can be done best in a coordinated manner at the central level, but centralizing also reduces the agency of people at the local level. So I think that is a huge challenge. It's opening a whole new can of worms and very tricky development problems. The issue of people's agency, the issue of who decides, who's at risk, who's creating risk. So how our legislation in the third decade of the 21st century is going to resolve that tension is something we have to contend with. The second issue is of risk language. Over the last 10 years or 20 years, the disaster risk management community has basically resolved it for our sphere of work. We know we have a common language. We know what is risk management. We know what is exposure. We know what is vulnerability. We know we have some risk metrics. Now you begin to put into that basket risks which are difficult to quantify, leave alone modeling them. So what is the kind of language do you use? Now, the way we use exposure in disaster risk management for man-made and natural hazards, that's not how exposure is understood in, say, conflict settings, or in even in pandemic. In pandemic, exposure has a slightly different connotation. So how are we going to come up with a common risk language, which basically is understood widely, around which we can, the language becomes a vehicle for forging a consensus across different arenas. And I'm sure within UNDP itself, you must be confronting that challenge as you talk to your colleagues that are looking at other risks facing the development. The third point is the point related to capacity and culture. We are living in a time of deep uncertainty about the future. Even within the last year and now this coming year, we now know how little we know, and what an uncertain environment we are living in. We have to have a much more nimble system of responding to threats as they emerge, responding to new knowledge about threats as they emerge, adapting our development paradigm. And when you look at climate-related issues and specifically local level manifestations of climate change. While there's a clear signal on the direction of climate change, we don't know how it will manifest itself in different locations. In such a context, when you design a development project and you say that, look, this is the project we have, we will invest in this area to build, say, a highway or a metro line or whatever for the 5 years, but we can't give you a final budget because we don't know what the world would look like. We would like to continue to adjust it. Our institutions just don't have that culture. Our institutions are not designed to respond to uncertainties. Flexibility, we are flexibility averse. So how do you, and note, linked to that issue of institutional culture is the issue of institutional capacity. Who has the capacity? Where is that capacity to actually begin to outline those uncertainties and begin to plan in the environment of increasing risks, but also deep uncertainties on no longer on a decadal time scales, now in the time scales of 5 years, multiples of 5 years now. So how are we going to do that? So I think these are the three big buckets. How do we sort of resolve the tension between the central and the local in our legislative and institutional frameworks? How do we invent a common risk language? And finally, what is the kind of capacity and institutional culture it will take to look at risk in a holistic sense, step out of the comfort zones of our respective domains. In my case, it happens to be disaster and climate risk. I think these are the three things. As I said, Ron, we don't have answers yet, but we are, confronting these challenges. We are faced with these things in our day-to-day work, and this is what keeps us awake in the night. And I think, so I'm here in this conversation, not really so much to say that this is a good practice, but to really think together and find what could be the possible directions for the future. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Kamal. As I said before, always a delight to hear your framing and certainly your candid comments around the fact that India, who has also made significant strides in terms of this 21st century problems that we're facing, is still grappling with these issues. And as you said, it's a wicked problem, so to speak. And I think what we're trying to do here is to apply appreciative inquiry to identify what are some of the ways we can go forward. So you've given us three clear buckets to think on this. And I'm sure as we go through the Q&A, there may be some questions around what signals you're seeing, despite the fact that it is early days. So you talked about legislation and the issue of the principles of subsidiarity as a main approach that we've often thought that we had to be closer to the ground to solve the problem, but the fact that that may lead in itself to some blind spots. The issue of how risk registers are managed and the tensions between the center and the local level that we now need to look at finding some sort of balance within the legislative and institutional dynamics to be able to address that. And most important to that is the issue of agency. So if we're a development organization and we're talking about risk to development, then we can't impact the agency of people because people are central to development. And I think that came out in your approach. Risk language, resolving the issues of the coherence in the risk language in order to foster what I call a unity of purpose is certainly something I heard coming from your comments. And then this issue of capacity and culture, the known knowns and the known unknowns, and whether or not we have the capacity to really function in a nimble and agile way to go beyond the current limits of our institutional design to consider these particular uncertainties. Quite interesting, Kamal. I think you've raised enough food for thought here as we continue our reshaping. Our next speaker is Mr. Kai. I won't venture to try to pronounce our good friend's first name. It's an interesting name. We'll come back to that at some point. Kai heads the Disaster Reduction Unit at the African Union Commission. He's a development and humanitarian specialist with over 17 years of experience in disaster risk management, peace building and conflict management, and complex emergencies in the African region. Kai, we're delighted that you could join us today, and I'd be interested to hear from you how the African Union is fostering sustainable financing for risk-informed development, considering the specific risk context in the African region, which is characterized by multiple cascading and intersecting threats, such as natural hazard risk, those impacted by climate and conflict. The floor is yours, Kai. I'm quite keen to hear from you this morning.
Thank you very much, Jackson. Madam Osako Okai, dear panelists, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I am very privileged to join you in this important dialogue. And I can't emphasize more than what Jackson said before, that some of us are talking on subject that is quite beyond our comfort zone. And one of the topics I don't like talking about is financing, because this is a very tricky subject matter. And this is because one of the complexities we are dealing with is looking at financing risk as an alternative option, rather than really ensuring that risk need to undertake, development need to undertake risk financing as a core activity, because you can't develop without understanding what development entails, the social dynamics that come with it. And indeed, financing resilience and risk reduction has been one of the bottlenecks, if not the main issue facing the implementation of disaster risk reduction agenda in the African continent. There is generally a tendency in practicing wait and see sort of financing arrangement. And this arrangement usually means that you have a disaster management funds that are released after a disaster occurs. There are also two major problems with this kind of approach. First, usually this kind of funding come too late, and even sometimes it's even too little to serve the purpose. And secondly, it also tries to sensitize the world of vulnerability by giving people some sort of false hope that authorities are in control, which is not true. And this really making people to engage in risky development endeavors. Further compounding on this situation, regardless of this challenge that comes with this funding, not many African countries really have this form of financing. And where they exist, they are mostly single hazard focus. And most of the time they are poorly replenished, and at times they suffer bureaucratic bottlenecks. By no comparison, this orthodox approach to disaster risk financing cannot really challenge the contemporary reality that we are in. We are in a very fragile and predictable 21st century realities. And this sort of orthodox approach cannot really work at this current situation. And I can't say more than what Kamal said, that our institutions are not prepared to the new thinking. And with that, what I mean by the complexity we are in is that disasters are increasingly becoming complex and cascading. In Africa, we have seen natural hazard, climate change, development itself, epidemic, pests and diseases, and conflict are interacting in unexpected ways. And this is also challenging our understanding of risk in the world we live. And solutions that are big will not make this risk, will not help us to address them. And we have also seen COVID-19 has further emboldened the need to act differently. Before COVID-19, in 2015, we had Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And we thought this was a very important lesson for African countries to capitalize on. We had emergency response funds that was at continental level, and that funding was used to respond to Ebola outbreak. And it really worked. It really helped the Pan-African solidarity in that regard. But then came polar worms, that locust invasion, among many other risks. And suddenly there was no funding because the fund was not replenished. And recently we had COVID-19. Many governments were caught and prepared. Some that were having disaster management funds were able to activate the funds to respond to COVID-19. Others, began to establish new disaster management funds from scratch. Now, looking backward, I think we have had enough, and I think it is time we should be thinking of multi-hazard and sustainable financing arrangement. And by having multi-hazard funding, to me, it's cheaper, and it can also be sustainable because it can also minimize costs associated with administrative processes involved with managing so many disaster funds. And again, as I said earlier, part of the new thinking is that the African Union has established the Africa risk capacity because we believe risk transfer mechanism can also be instrumental in providing financing that is needed to respond immediately after a disaster. And in 2012, we established the Africa risk capacity. It's still a work in progress, but a lot of work is going on. The idea is to ensure that we have timely declaration of emergency and disbursement of funds by government, knowing that they will be able to be paid out later on. And we believe this funding has potential to break cycle of poverty by protecting livelihoods of the most vulnerable communities. However, having this kind of funding, whether insurance, whether risk transfer, or whether disaster risk financing funds, can never replace risk-sensitive financing. The best solution, we believe, at the disposal of government is to ensure mainstreaming disaster risk in development programs. And this should be done in an integrated manner with climate change adaptation. Unfortunately, the opposite is true. The current available financing, even development financing, have likely excluded the disaster risk reduction communities. And as we all know, climate sensitive development is not at all risk informed. Emerging collaborations in security also provide a rare opportunity in breaking silos between climate change, peace building, and disaster risk reduction. We have started here in African Union. We have established what we call the interdepartmental cluster on climate security. The idea is to ensure that we bridge silos with regard to risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and peace building, which just started last year and is a work in progress. We have also established an interdepartmental working group on disaster risk reduction. And the idea is to ensure that all AU programs and projects take into account disaster risk as well as climate change adaptation. This kind of effort need to be strengthened at institutional level. And indeed, there is a need for a continued dialogue between climate change and DRR communities, as well as wider communities, development communities, to ensure that financing development is designed and implemented in a comprehensive manner. If the communities do not talk to one another, then those with leverage, particularly Ministry of Finance, parliamentary committees, and donors should provide necessary incentives to force these communities to a table. In addition, we have also seen that international financing also adds some of the problems because sometimes they are not really coordinated. There is need to ensure that international assistance is offered through designated authorities and in a way that unlocks domestic financing for greater sustainability. This requires prior informed engagement with relevant stakeholders Apparently, most available financing are negotiated at donor headquarters, and actually this need really to change. In conclusion, risks are becoming complex, less predictable and diffuse, and therefore financing must follow that trend. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kai. I particularly liked how you started. You spoke to this wait and see financing approach. Quite interesting. But most importantly, the fact that that approach is socializing our societies into risky behaviors. I kind of put in bracket here, don't worry, create the mess, the money will come to clean it up thereafter. And it's certainly something we're trying to escape. You pointed to the orthodox approach to financing being unable to deliver on this multifaceted risk landscape of the current century and beyond. To offer a fit-for-purpose development solution, we require an understanding of the interplay between these complex multi-hazard landscape issues, and you outlined that this is certainly critical. You pointed out that COVID-19 is challenging us to act differently. And I heard inherent in your presentation a question to us as we consider this multidimensional issue. Are we up to this challenge? We've not, since the Ebola scare, been up to the challenge. Will we now embrace a new approach to the understanding the financial requirements to reduce, prevent, prepare, and respond to a multi-dimensional and systemic issue, therefore building resilient societies? And you pointed to the role that international financing plays in all of this, in terms of whether or not it is feeding this fragmentation, or is it facilitating a coordinated approach? And last but not least, the importance of development financing excluding disaster risk. Has this aggravated the problem of risk from development, or the consideration of risk to sustaining development gains? Thank you again, Kai, very interesting. Our next speaker, Mr. Marcus Oxley. Marcus is the Managing Director of Resilient Solutions, a consultancy practice, and has worked with the global consultancy firm ACOM, providing climate change, disaster resilience, and sustainable development advisory and capacity building services for the public and private sector-based clients. He has worked with governments and NGOs across Africa, Asia, and Europe on actions to prevent disasters and strengthen the resilience of communities and organizations. Marcus, thank you for joining us today. And my question to you is, what are the challenges and opportunities in the private sector to move the needle towards a more comprehensive approach to risk-informed development?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Ron. Yeah, so let me share with you some experiences I've just had actually with a very large private sector organization, ACOM. Probably not many of you have heard of ACOM, but it's actually one of the largest engineering, architectural, construction companies in the world. So very much involved in building transport systems, building water systems, building urban environments, social infrastructure systems. So it very much is at the heart of doing that. And over the last 9 months, I was asked to join ACOM and particularly take a lead in developing what was called nature-based solutions. So these are solutions that try to bring together green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, and the more traditional grey infrastructure. And if you think about infrastructure, it is highly significant because it is probably one of the primary determinants between this relationship between human systems and natural systems. It's our built environment which actually is at that physical interface between how our social economic development interfaces with our environment within our natural systems. And this is why nature-based solutions as a possible hybrid of bringing together more traditional grey steel concrete type approaches and linking that with more environmental aware ecosystem thinking. That's where there's a potential nexus there between DRR, between climate change, between development, biodiversity. So I was brought on board to see if I could advance that thinking. I'm actually a civil engineer originally, but worked in the private sector. And of course, you know, what we know is that we've got this huge demand within our societies for infrastructure. There's a huge unmet need, if you like, for infrastructure investment. And of course, AECOM has got expertise in this, and it's truly a transdisciplinary organization that has this skill set and obviously recognizes the opportunity for more integrated approaches. So I kind of came on board thinking, well, this is it. You know, there's some fantastic opportunities of bringing all these different disciplines together in real life infrastructure projects. Not quite as easy as it seems, actually, though, when you actually get in there. And that's primarily because the way that the private sector primarily engages and obtains work is very much through this competitive tendering processes. So when a private sector company responds to what's called an expression of interest or a request for proposals from various clients, whether it's public sector, government clients, or private sector clients, it's very much responding competitively to a project which has been defined. And those projects actually tend to be defined quite narrowly against certain objectives. It might be a climate objective, it might be an urban water sector objective, it might be a transport sector objective. But the point is, once the private sector is asked to tender for a project, the die is cast as to how that project is actually defined. And although there are definite co-benefits which can be unlocked through investment in water systems and energy systems and transport systems, the private sector company is competing against other companies in quite limited project criteria and has got very little movement in a competitive tendering process to actually unlock synergies and bring in some of these wider co-benefits. And that is particularly the case when you go into lower income countries where governments are quite fiscally constrained in the resources that they have for infrastructure investment, and therefore tend to go down what's called a PPP process. So their procurement processes are public-private partnership procurement processes, which try to blend private-public actors to actually, you know, to unlock resources to invest in this infrastructure. But of course, for the private sector, when it's tendering for a PPP project, what it's really looking for is how to reduce uncertainty. Because if you want the commitment of that private sector capital and the private sector input, then what the private sector needs is some degree of security in terms of the project revenues, the cash flows, the margins, the return, the profit on that upfront investment. And so therefore, when the private sector is looking at risk, it's very much looking at how do you reduce that uncertainty. It's not about how do you optimize the co-benefits and unlock all these wider environmental, climate adaptation, DRR co-benefits. It's very much about looking at downside risk and how do you make sure that you have that continuity of cash flow over the project life cycle. And that project life cycle for infrastructure can often be much shorter than the asset life cycle of that infrastructure. So when we're building road systems or energy systems or water systems, typically a concession period is about 20 years. So we're looking at the return on investment over a 20-year period. But actually, if you look at the lifetime of that asset, actually transport systems, road, bridges, dams, these assets are there for about, 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And of course, the longer term benefits, and this is particularly when you're looking at nature-based solutions, longer term benefits accrue over a period of time. and yet the return on the investment has to be, has to be recovered over a much shorter time frame, over the project time frame, as opposed to the asset time frame. So this defines the parameters, if you like, within which the private sector engages. And it very much goes back to the point that Kamal says, where in actual fact, it's the government that sets the rules of the game. It's the policies and the legislations and the way that projects are conceived, the way that the project inception, identification, preparation, that's the stage where you've got the potential leverage to actually bring about some of these wider, unlock some of these wider co-benefits. Because once it goes to the tendering process, the die is cast, and therefore you're tendering against quite rigid parameters, which can be often quite narrow parameters. So the key really is how do we get this thinking more upstream of the project cycle? How do we really get this more integrated, holistic thinking into the way that projects are being conceived, into the way that project objectives are being defined? And how do we incentivize the private sector to actually optimize these co-benefits? We all know those co-benefits are there. We know that infrastructure, if built in a green, grey, blended hybrid infrastructure, can achieve a series of economic objectives, but can also achieve carbon sequestration objectives, carbon adaptation objectives, DRR objectives. So the challenge is, how do you incentivize the private sector to use its creativity and ingenuity and undoubted skills within the sector? I was always amazed by how much transdisciplinary the skills there are in these organizations. But it's how do you unlock that potential and incentivize that? And I think that's the challenge that we have, really. And we very much need those pathfinder projects. We need the exemplars which can show the way. And I think that the public sector, investments by the public sector, should be the exemplar of actually how we optimize and unlock these co-benefits. So I think we need those important pathfinder projects. It's not easy, but I think if we show the way, I think that's where we can then push this into the more orthodoxy, into the mainstream. So let me stop there. There's quite a lot in that.
Absolutely, Marcus. Thank you very much for those very important insights. A reflection from a different angle, which I found also quite interesting. The fact that there is a sensitivity to the need for integration within the private sector, but you've quite rightly outlined some of the barriers presented by the way we design and define projects, which constrains the private sector really applying, sort of these sensitivities they have to this integrated approach to looking at risk. You talked about the inherent co-benefits, even within some of these projects, but again, spoke to the way we procure, we tender, which in itself, mitigates against the private sector's willingness to unlock these co-benefits, because it inherently focuses on the sort of profit issues, profit margins, looking at the revenues and trying to reduce uncertainties to revenue generation, etc. So you also spoke to the role of government as an enabler in unlocking the opportunities of the integrated designing of projects and including incentivizing the private sector. Quite interesting. And so our next speaker, Angelica Planets, I think is going to be bringing some spotlight on some of these points raised as she walks through the current evolving UNDP offer, which I think is going to, I suspect, speak to some of these very important elements that have come out probably from the point of view of entry points. So I want to invite my colleague, Angelica Planets, who is the team leader for the disaster risk reduction practice within the DRT, to share with us on how UNDP intends to evolve its approach to risk-informed development in supporting this multi-risk approach. Angelica has over 24 years of experience in disaster and climate risk management and risk governance at national, regional, and global levels with the UN and civil society. She joined us in 2012 and has an academic background in public administration and development studies. She's a graduate of the German Development Institute. Angelica, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ron, and hello to everyone. So it's really a pleasure to be here with you today during the event. And as Ron mentioned, I'm going to share a little bit where we are at with developing this next level risk-informed development offer. So let me start maybe by highlight that this risk offer is firmly situated in the global policy frameworks. And as you can see, actually, this is not anything particularly new, but started already in the 1990s, actually. But in recent years, there has been a much growing recognition that these, in the frameworks, that disasters, conflict, and other crises are the result of quite similar underlying causes and vulnerabilities, and therefore also require more integrated solutions. But this is basically where we are still at to get to those integrated solutions. Now, the offer also provides a very strong rationale for risk-informed development. So we state very clearly that the current trajectory of conflict, disasters, and fragility is seriously challenging the achievements of the SDGs. Already in the event, we named many, many different kinds of crises, from the pandemic to droughts to typhoons, Ebola, refugee crisis. Really, development progress is at risk. But secondly, also the development process itself, when it is flawed, can be a driver of risk. And this aspect is quite often overlooked by policymakers and development practitioners alike. So decisions on investments can lead to populations or economic assets being located in hazardous areas, or they can also lead to conflicts over shared resources between different populations. And thirdly, and making matters actually much more worse and complicated, is that these risks are increasingly intersecting. So they create unknown dynamics with compounding effects. And again, the COVID pandemic is actually a textbook example of these compounding and interconnected impacts that occur across systems and geographies as well. So now, what does this all mean for the UNDP risk-informed offer? It means that our approach must infuse UNDP's development practice with this approach, rather than treating risk or crisis as an add-on. It also means that we can no longer rely on those single hazard or single risk approaches. We need to find an offer that can link the different risk management work streams in the organization together. And thirdly, what we need is to have a clear focus in our offer on how to infuse planning, budgeting, and implementation, with risk measures that are concrete and can be measured in terms of the results that we can achieve. And finally, that would need also that we look at the tools we have, adapt them, or maybe identify new ones, tools that can bring the approach together and establish those things. Now, on our journey to designing the offer, it really started during our team retreat of the DRR and recovery last week, because what we felt is that to secure the long-term impact of our DRR and recovery work, we need to work much more closely with the other practice areas. We organized an online consultation globally, which included internal and external partners in January and February. And we also commissioned several knowledge products on systemic risk governance and urban resilience to inform our offer. There is also currently, many of you will know, a lot of work going on developing other offers in UNDP on conflict prevention, fragility, and recovery. And we are working closely with colleagues to make sure that there is close alignment here as well. So the aim is by June, July to have this offer finalized, ready to support implementation of the next UNDP strategic plan. Now, coming to the heart of the offer, it is organized in 3 categories. So the first one is what we deliver at country and regional level. The second is, how we can support the UN system and partners with this approach. And the third one, what we have to do in-house in terms of the GPN support and collaboration. And again, the objective is to embrace a multidimensional risk, and we move beyond a focus on disaster and climate risk only. Now, this is probably the big bulk of the offer, the country and regional support. Here we are envisaging 5 buckets of areas of support. It's quite a busy slide, so I'm trying to break this down. So obviously, the evidence base for risk development is important. And here we need to see practical links between a broad range of analysis methodologies that we have in the toolbox of risk and development practitioners, so we can capture this multidimensional nature of risk and the broader context. Secondly, in support of risk-informed policy, we will focus mainly on coherence and complementarity between different policy objectives. So we will drive co-benefit solutions that can address multiple risks and also support the long-term goal setting with a focus on managing these policy trade-offs across different interest groups. Now, in order for our program countries to be able to implement this new evolved concept, of course, we need to work on capacity and skills development. And here the focus will be on adaptive planning, scenario planning, and portfolio management. But we also need to help really with changing mindsets and organizational cultures. So we are working with a broad spectrum of institutions here working in the realm of development planning, financing, risk management, risk pooling, and social protection. And finally, but not least, the offer will prioritize the most vulnerable populations, so they have agency in this risk-informed process, and importantly, that they can benefit directly from it. So here, political economy analysis important to understand what are the interests and motives of different stakeholders in both risk creation but also risk reduction. So the second element of the offer is focuses on UN system collaboration and partnerships. And we really see that UNDP is probably in quite a unique position to push the risk-informed agenda, but we can't deliver it alone. So partnering with UN and non-UN organizations is important, and you can see here listed some of the ones we are planning to work with and also to what end. In the interest of time, I have to move over this quickly and go to the third leg of the offer, which is the in-house focus to ensure that UNDP is appropriately equipped to accompany our program countries and partners on this challenging journey. And here, for and foremost, is staff capacity and training, but also awareness. And secondly, program design, that we are actually able to support programs that are long-term and transformational. And thirdly, our ability to work cross-practice on integrated solutions. So in summary, here again, the key features of this offer, it will be multi-risk, multi-scale, driven from within the organization's development practice. So it should not be seen anymore as a risk management add-on. It will build on our governance principles and the lessons from our risk governance work. It will be applicable in different country contexts, pursue a systems approach, and finally will be people-centered and multi-stakeholders. So not a small task, but by bringing the house together, we are confident that we'll be able to address this. And with this, Ron, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelica. I know 8 minutes is a short time to really unpack what is in that offer. But I really want to pull on a couple of things that came out in your slides. And yes, you did in fact pull up on some of those key points made by the earlier speakers. You talked about the importance of designing integrated solutions to respond to these complex development contexts. And at the center of this, I think what came out, is for us to be able to move out of our comfort zone and really embrace what we're talking about, we have to understand that this is really about integrated planning and budgeting approaches, really, understanding the full range of issues in our planning, in our budgeting, or resource allocation, and building the capacity to deliver that. So you outline five very important areas of the offer. One, which is creating the evidence, the assessments, the analysis, which has to be, multi-risk to be able to do that, to be able to allow us to have integrated planning. You spoke to the policy design and policy coherence issues, which I think are going to be very central. Risk-informed implementation and capacity. Within all of that, you talked about a number of very critical tools. And our next speaker, I think, is going to be pulling on some of these issues around evidence and tools and understanding risk to really bring the sort of platform for this risk-informed approach. And then this issue of sustainable financing. And here you look at things like the public expenditure and investment reviews to be able to better look at our allocation of resources. It brings me back to Kai's point around how we are allocating resources. And then I think most importantly, people at the center, stakeholder driven, and how UNDP can also act as a convener for providing some of the voice and agency of individuals in this risk-informed approach. There's certainly more within that box of the risk-informed offer that can come out, and I hope it comes out in the question and answer. And I want to turn quickly to Laurel Patterson, who again is a eminent UNDP team member. She's the head of the SDG integration team here in UNDP. She has over 17 years of experience with UNDP and has held several positions working on crisis, fragility, resilience, planning and partnerships, rule of law, and social cohesion. A very good mix of subjects to really bring light to some of the conversations we're having here. Thanks for joining us, Laurel. My question to you is, when looking at the intersection of quantitative and qualitative risk information, how can we bring together scientific rigor on the one hand and individual risk perceptions and the social reimagination of risk on the other? Over to you, Laurel. Looking forward to hearing your perspectives here.
Ron, thank you so much. And for Kamal, for Marcus and Kai, thank you also for your insights, and Asako for kicking us off so well. I've changed a little bit my remarks just based on my reflections as many of you have been providing inputs. And one of the things that I was thinking about as Ron was introducing all of us in different ways, why do we introduce ourselves this way? And it's because, I would argue, we're trying to share with each other the multiple contexts, the multiple perspectives, the multiple experiences that each of us is bringing into this space. It's impacting the way that we see issues. It's impacting the way we make decisions on issues, and it changes as we go. And it gives us an insight into each other that if I was only describing myself as Laurel SDGs, can talk about SDGs, fine, but we miss the richness that Ron has provided in some of the background on all of us. And this became clear to me this morning. I have 3 children, and my daughter was telling me that there was going to be a discussion in the school today around social justice. We live in New York, and the trial of Derek Chauvin yesterday and his murder conviction is on people's minds. Us in the UN system, and those of us in New York, we've received messages also from security saying, while violence isn't expected, we do expect gatherings. We do expect a reflection, because this impacts us all in different ways, and it connects issues right now in the midst of COVID differently than it would have before. What we want to try and do is use advanced analytics to develop new tools and approaches that allow us to hold on to this complexity without looking for a single linear solution or point out of it. And just maybe to share a little bit of a funny part at the end of that story is I said to my daughter, well, I would love to join that discussion if you're having it today. And she said, it's not for moms, because To her, I have a more of a single point, context, and it is separate from other things. But of course, it isn't in the way that we live and experience all of this. And the panelists are bringing such rich diversity and perspective. So I really want to, and you all are too. And I think the way that Asako opened the panel, what you've heard from all of our colleagues, Angelica too, in terms of the risk-informed offer, this is for all of us. You are all risk practitioners. You are all contributing into this space. So the ownership is really collective in this room. And for that reason, I'm looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. Let me touch on two things and do my job like Ron asked me to do. So two things that I wanted to reflect on with all of you. One is about how we model systemic risk. What does that mean? Where are we going? And I think Kamal, you had also, Kai also sort of pointed to some potential direction. And I think the honest reflection which we all have is that we're sort of existing in this soup right now. I don't think there's a clear pathway or answer to the question. Maybe it's not to answer the question, but with the recognition that's clear is that we're moving away from a hazard by hazard risk reduction, right? And we want to ensure that we have models and metrics that really help us to hold, as I say, hold the complexity and help us see into patterns and navigate the uncertainty which is all around us now. And so part of what we're focused on in UNDP is incentivizing interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, integrated risk assessments, risk analysis, and decision making. I want to talk about that next, so that we improve efficiency, we reduce duplications, and we really allow for connected collective action. So this is what systemic risk asks of us. I think this is an interesting and emergent space of understanding risk. I'll put a couple of resources and references in the chat for those who may not be as familiar and interested. There's a knowledge action network on emergent risk, which is mainly focused on the academic community with really fascinating ideas and insights. And so I'll share some of that as we go, because I think there's a lot that we're building these collaboration with academia, but that we can certainly build from in taking this forward. So on the UNDP side, we have a significant investment, which is over many, many years on understanding risk and developing a crisis risk dashboard, which brings together different understandings of risk across different spheres and sectors. And this is to help our colleagues in different countries and contexts navigate, identify, and act early to prevent losses of different kinds of scope and nature. And at the same time, one of the things we've been focusing on the integration team is the Data Futures platform, where we're really looking to create a user-driven space where people can start to navigate data and develop insights, distill insights differently than they may have been in the past. So there's a series of simulations. What if this? What if fossil fuel subsidies were reduced in my country? What would that mean? How would that impact fiscal space? What could it do to poverty levels? How can I start to connect that thinking with other ideas that I'm having around, for example, temporary basic income, or advocating for basic incomes in certain countries or contexts as a result of COVID? When I think into that a little bit further, I'm asking myself, with basic incomes, how would I prioritize and target most vulnerable? How could I do that in a way that maximized limited resources? And here we're working with some data visualization storytellers, which are helping us literally to visualize that. And we'll have this on the space soon with a beta test case in Bangladesh to give a sense of that as well too. The other thing we're working with is University of Denver on futures modeling to ask questions. What could the world look like? Not next year, although we would like to know that too. But what are the potential futures out of COVID over the next 10 and over the next 50 years? How can we use that information, think backwards to make the choices now that can have the biggest impact? How do we do that in a way that is cognizant that there's no first day that we're dealing with? We're in a context which is seeped in drivers of certain risks as well as certain strengths and opportunities. So how can we be cognizant of where we are, but also look to the future, recognize that models themselves, which are based on historical patterns, are not going to be able to predict the future? That's something that we're going to have to do collectively. So I think there's a lot of work in modeling. I'm giving you a little bit of a quick sense of where we are with UNDP and what we hope can also promote creative thinking in this space and creative use of data and analytics to help identify those options, those choices that can really have the best impact towards the future that we want. The last point that I wanted to make is around decision making. So how can we use better knowledge and insights of risk, multiple risks, cascading and intersecting risk, to improve the choices and the decisions that we make, and especially in events like COVID, which have very complex cascading and intersecting risk. And part of this is an area of understanding risk and risk modeling, which is being piloted right now, which is in the use of storytelling. So how can we use storytelling to hold on to the complexity of systemic risks, and how can we use those stories to drive effective decision making? Ultimately, any of these models, all the things we're talking about here, and Marcus spoke eloquently to this as well too. How do we incentivize change? How do we bring together the right coalitions? What are those pathfinder projects and so on that we want to amplify? So all of this is around getting this into action and use, and that requires people to make decisions and choices differently. And so one of the things I'll also share in the chat is work that a coalition of climate researchers based out of Norway are working on right now, is a storytelling project to help manage emergent climate risks. And so storytelling, it helps us make sense out of chaos, but it's also a route to our emotions. And we know that this is critical for the way that any of us, all of us, make choices and decisions in how we see our actions and that of the collective taking shape and moving forward. So I wanted to share with you 3 reflections on why storytelling, connected with all of the advances in modeling that they can offer us to help understand certain potentialities, certain risks, certain intersections, and how we can use stories to take that even further towards decision making and collective action that is reflective of the future that we want. And that's a reflection on 3 aspects of storytelling as a way of helping us navigating systemic risk. And the first is understanding stories as light. The second is stories as glue. We'll get there next. Stories as light. Stories help us illuminate the past, the present, the future, and they light up pathways for change. It helps us understand where fault lines are. It helps us make changes in real time, and it helps us build a coherent narrative around both the challenges and the opportunity of the present, but also it shines a light for us on the future change pathways. So stories help us from that perspective of light. Stories as glue also help us build empathy and build cohesion and collaboration with each other. So it's a way of building a community through coherence and empathy. Stories help people to connect across different opinions, different outlooks and so on, and also to generate narratives that hold groups together. And this is, very steeped, I think I don't need to say, to this group in the history of humanity, and a particularly powerful tool here. And the third and final is stories as web. So how can we change our personal narratives that we have about our lives towards those choices and that future that we're looking to emerge, and the systemic risk that we want to be able to hold and navigate as a collective? Stories as a web also help us change cultural narratives that are framing the issues that we're advocating for. And stories also help us influence our worldview and our collective beliefs in this regard. So we think that this tool and approach, and again, being prototyped among many, but with a number of researchers, can help us bridge the gap between information that we may be able to generate through quantitative models with the actions that we want to see towards the collective future objectives that we have. So in closing, I wanted to share also the criticality that we see at UNDP in accompanying the work on risk with the mindset shifts, which all of my colleagues on the panelists have spoken to earlier. And so, and this is for all of us in this conversation as well too, to recognize the power of our agency and our ability to make choices that will create a better future. And those are choices that are manifest in many aspects of our life, not only the work name and title that we happen to hold today. But these are models and these are approaches and these are stories that need to generate options. There's no one future pathway, and there will never be a group, even in our group here, that's going to see the same future as the optimal one. So how do we create opportunities? How do we create spaces like our Data Futures platform and these different kinds of analytical assets so that users can generate choice and options that make sense in their context and reflect their values and their worldview? So how do we do that and then build coherence around it? So UNDP is also doing a significant amount of work in creating spaces for generative dialogue. We're connecting it with a lot of what Angelica has described in terms of the risk-informed development offer. And we hope that many of you will stay engaged and involved. I will leave it there. I'm sure I'm over time, Ron, but thank you all. Over for me.
Thank you, Laurel. I found it very interesting, as I'm sure many of our participants did. In fact, someone did put in the chat that they did. Very, very interesting, Laurel, the way we introduce ourselves. And I paraphrase, so forgive me, as an avatar for the different lens that we need to see and bring to the complex environments, a means to connect the issues. I think, trying to capture your opening, which again, quite valuable reflection, and that's your opening, but I think you closed with providing us with some very important approaches that may solve this issue we've been grappling with for a long time around how we integrate as teams, how we better integrate, how we better connect these dots, and talking about the approach of using stories, storylines as light, storylines as glue, storylines as web. It'd be interesting to see how that research evolves into solutions around how we get people to integrate beyond these silos. You talked about the importance of analytics and how these may help us deal with complex issues and also connect these dots. Reminding us all that we're risk practitioners. We tend to view risk in these very hard lines when it really is permeating all of what we do and should be treated in that way. Looking at issues around modeling, and in my previous life, I taught on disaster risk and spoke to this approach around using scenarios, Steve R, looking 5, 10, 15, 20 years into the future by tracking some of these very important variables and shifts. I think you articulated that in your presentation around how we can use models, use scenarios to better see what tipping points may occur, what points of failures could exist, tipping points positively or negatively, so that we can plan better and budget better. Quite interesting sets of reflections there. And then you talked about decision making, risk understanding to make better development decisions, appealing to our consciousness using a mix then of these storytelling scenarios and foresighting and modeling approaches. I think this is certainly the foundation on which a risk-informed offer needs to also evolve. So we're looking to work closely with you and the other members in the team as we go forward in the future around some of these elements. Colleagues, we've had a very interesting exchange. We have a few minutes for questions. As we wait on our participants to put forward some questions, I want to start with a question to all of you. I'm going to give you 2 minutes each to probably reflect on this. You can opt out if you choose. Now that you've heard from UNDP and what we're doing in terms of the risk-informed development offer, what do you think our biggest added value could be, and in what areas do you think we really need to step it up? So I'll pose this first to our government, our private sector, and our African Union colleagues. I think that's who I want to hear from, not Angelica and and Laurel. I want to hear from the stakeholders outside of UNDP. How do you see us, really shifting this offer? Where do you think we need to step it up? And what do you think our added value could be in this particular area? I'll start with Kamal in that order. Kamal, since you spoke first, we'll go with you first.
Thanks, Ron. I think there is, of course, the issue of comprehensive programming to advance this agenda, but I will focus on just one thing, which I think is UNDP's comparative area of advantage, which is upstream engagement, policy engagement to bring about that policy shift over the medium term. Unless that happens, the success of programming will always be unstable and shaky. For example, and how would you sort of measure success? What would success look like of that upstream engagement? If in a few years you see that X number of countries, when they do their annual economic survey, the state of the economy, they have the multi-risk and resilience angle to it, not just a chapter on disasters, somewhere in the corner, but, the whole sort of risk to resilience to multiple shocks, multiple hazards, multiple scenarios is embedded in it. Second could be if, in the finance ministry or wherever the planning happens, you have somebody who's responsible for maintaining a risk register. And you see that, twice a year, the senior policymakers sit around the table and look at, what is the future looking like. I think if we had sort of that high level upstream engagement, in the olden days, UNDP used to have senior economists sometimes working very closely with ministries of finance to bring about that higher level systemic change, high level policy change. I think something like that, if that's done, and if we can demonstrate that in 5-10 countries in the next 2-3 years, I think that would really propel this whole agenda forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamal. We're going to go to Kai now.
Thank you, Jackson. In Africa here, we are working very closely with the UNDP team. And I can assure you UNDP has very strong competitive advantage when it comes to both regional and national level, given that it has a very widespread presence in many African countries. If we talk about sustainable financing and breaking silos, I think we are talking about one thing, is coordination. And we have seen that we keep talking about all this all the time, that there is need to break silos. But what does this really mean at country level? In many countries, there is absence of legislation that really bring these sectors together. They have different legislation, they sit differently. And I think UNDP has a very important role to help, bring these communities through national platforms. The disaster risk reduction platforms is an institution really that need to be strengthened. It could be an entry point to start dialogue. It may not be the ultimate solution, but at least some of the issues, if these platforms are sitting, they will be able to discuss and then find some way forward. And I think UNDP national offices could really help with this, because if we have a strong national coordination, and we will be able to address some of these challenges. I think the other leverage that UNDP has is using its global work on SDGs, Sendai framework, and Paris Agreement. And we know UNDP as one of the beneficiaries of the Green Climate Funds, that one of the implementing agency. So I think also UNDP need to use this connection and capacity to be able to bring these communities together when it comes to discussing financing at the international level. And again, as I said earlier, we will not have sustainable financing unless international financing has an objective of mobilizing domestic financing. And unless these things are communicating, we will not be able to address some of these challenges. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Kai. And then over to you, Marcus.
Yeah, I think similar to some of the comments earlier, actually, I think it is about crafting this shared vision, and about it's a convening function, it's an envisaging function. It's, I think, working with governments and really trying to develop that systems-wide perspective, and help them to envision how these different bits fit together. To me, inherently, this is a challenge about sustainable development. This is ultimately what we're seeing in our climatic changes, in our increasing disasters, etc. These are all manifestations of unsustainable development. I think we need to work with governments in really understanding how this comes together, how these different parts can complement, how to optimize these different co-benefits to build this coherence. And I think as much as we've got nice words to do that, I think we need to show the way. We need to really demonstrate practically what this looks like at the subnational local level. How do you translate these grand ideas into actual policy practice on the ground? So I think the UN has a key convening, knowledge brokering, envisaging, supporting function to do that.
Thank you very, very much, Marcus. We don't have a lot of questions in the chat box, but we have a hand up from Alessandra. I want to give Alessandra the floor. Alessandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ron, and good morning or afternoon. I'm not quite sure what to say from this side of the world. So for the colleagues and the panelists who don't know me, Alessandra Casazza, I'm speaking from Nairobi, the UNDP Resilience Hub. I have a question. Well, first of all, thank you for the conversation, for this very engaging and interesting discussion. For us, it's extremely relevant, as we are also working, as you know, Ron, on our own offer linked to yours for Africa on resilience and risk-informed development. I really liked the way in which Kamal framed the discussion at the beginning and put sort of right there the issue of language, because this is one of the things that we are actually struggling with the most, not just across partners and in the way in which we talk about resilience and risk-informed development with our partners, but also within our own organization. And I wanted to ask Kamal, and I know he also posed the question and we don't have the answer, but how do we create more clarity? Because there's so much, can I say, I use deliberately this word, confusion around what we are talking about. And unless we are on the same page in terms of what resilience is about, what risk-informed development is about, we won't be able to advance the agenda. And so the issue of language, I think, is central. And a question for Kai, because I'm interested also, and we work with the Africa Risk Capacity, a question on the financing. So how much this issue of language and trying to define what risk-informed development is about, what resilience is about, actually has an impact on the capacity to mobilize resources to advance this agenda, and how can UNDP help more in this area, particularly the African Union and then African countries. Thanks, Ron, and over back to you.
Thank you, Ali. I will open the floor to our participants or panelists to respond. Kai, there's one specific for you, and there's a general reflection from Alessandra, perhaps for Kamal, on this issue, the importance of this issue of the language, risk language. I have some very interesting views on that, but too much for this.
I mean, on the common risk language, Alessandra, that's a great question. And it's a question for me as well. I really don't know. The only thing I can say is that sometimes I feel that the answer to that question is not going to come from among us. It will come from, somewhere else, people who are sort of on the front lines of, selling their policy proposals to the general public. I think the only thing I can say is that at the moment, multi-risk, the conversation around multiple risks is not even happening to the extent it should be happening outside of the, risk management profession. So I think if that conversation begins to happen, and that's what I was saying in my remarks earlier, that if UNDP's upstream engagement in some countries can foster that conversation, and we begin to see it reflected in key sort of high-level policy documents, that would be a way forward. But the straight answer to your question is, I don't know.
Kai?
Well, that is, I think sometime in 2018, we were interacting with our member states, and one person was really quite very clear and critical that sometimes we are creating unnecessary names, and they mean the same thing. And this is what you call unnecessary invention. I think we tend to create new names, but in the actual application, it means the same thing. And this is true of the CCA and DRR. And I think also it's not just, we are all, it is all of us, we are creating that confusion. And really it is a big issue. And I think we also need to bring it down to local levels. Because even now we are moving ahead. Now we are talking of anticipatory financing. We are talking of focus-based financing. And we are also talking now on a return on investment. I mean, we are adding more complexities into the space, and it really becomes really a big challenge. How UNDP can help with that, I think that is, I don't know. I don't have the correct answer, but I think it's important that we work together. We need to acknowledge that there is a problem, and we need to be able to be clear to the non-scientists or to the communities. We need to speak the same language, and I think that realization is very important. So I don't have, Alexander, I don't have a very specific answer to your question, unfortunately.
You do, you said it. But anyway, we're out of time, colleagues, but we had a question in the chat box from Simon Schultz, regarding whether there have been attempts to quantify the impact of disasters other than COVID-19 on sustainable development. Certainly country by country, Simon, within the context of application of methodologies such as the PDNAs, the DALAs, the CRNAs, etc. All of these approaches that look at not just the cost, but the losses over a longer period from an economic point of view. But certainly, maybe our colleagues may have other perspectives of other applications that may be applied, and we'll invite them perhaps to put in the chat box, given that we're out of time. Colleagues, in closing, I want to thank all of our panelists, or speakers, or participants who joined us and stayed with us throughout the process. It's been an absolute honor to moderate this excellent discussion. There certainly were some key takeaways, and before I get to them, we heard in the responses to the questions the importance of UNDP in advancing this risk-informed development offer from the point of view of high-level upstream engagement. And Kamal spoke to this issue approach of, the economists attached to government, and I'm coining from his comments here the application of a risk governance expert to help the sort of ministries of finance and planning be able to see this integrated risk approach, and to build the internal practice. After all, I think the entry point on some of these things has to be the arm of government that is engaged in the macroeconomic planning and budgeting processes. And so that might be an approach. Kai talked about the coordination issues, breaking these silos at country level in particular. And here UNDP perhaps playing a little bit more again of its role as integrator and convener, and helping to leverage international financing to unlock domestic financing. So if we're talking about sustainable financing around delivering this offer, the day is going to be one in leveraging domestic financing in a case-by-case situation. I think in Kai's attempt to answer this question and Kamal's attempt, the answer is there. It's staring us in the face. It's about simplifying our approach. We've seen a complex environment emerge and still emerging, but not recognizing that the people who we're calling on to absorb this, our country offices and governments, we're making it even more difficult for them, especially those that are fragile and that have limited capacity and space. So UNDP first has to simplify these processes. And so the work that Laurel is also talking about, I think, is towards making sure we can have a much more simplified way to be able to sense and understand the impact and the shock. So we have to continue on the path towards that. I was reading something from UNDP that UNDP developed several years ago, where it talked about, and in my practice, in my training, I should say, as an urban planner, we talked about ecosystems services as a means of reducing the risk. That term has transcended from what would have been urban planning into what we label disaster risk reduction, which is where it then emerged quite large. And now it has migrated from there into a climate language, where we talk about ecosystems-based adaptation. And therein lies the challenge I think we're grappling with. You know, how do we make sure we can come together in this language, simplified language of coherence that also leads to policy coherence. So some key takeaways from this session that I've managed to capture, and thanks to my colleagues who were helping me capture this: co-create and co-design with those that know what we don't, sooner rather than later. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable, break the silos, embrace the new thinking and innovations. Follow the money, influence development financing to embrace multi-risk financing that is predictable and sustainable. Bridge the gaps between national, local, and communities, engage them as users for modeling the future desired state that they want to see. So these are some of the four key messages, along with all of the valuable insights that came from each of the panels. And I think the big takeaway is, can we simplify this? And so the risk-informed development offer, as we evolve, we're going back to basics in a sense. We're coming full circle in ensuring that people have a very simple understanding of the problem that is faced and inherent in development, and the risk to development. And if we use planning and budgeting and finance as that space of intervention, we might be able to simplify this using the tools of foresight, scenario development, modeling, and storytelling. Thank you all. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I want to thank our ASG and our panelists and the audience for joining. I want to leave the last word to ASG Okai, just in case she wants to express her own thanks, since she is the patron of this dialogue. She has been a big champion around evolving this particular offer. So I want to leave some space for you, Asako, just to give any closing reflections that you have.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you all the participants and panelists for insightful discussion. As Ron has summarized very well, you have given us a lot of food for thought, and then we would certainly take forward some of the insight you have given me. Because of the time limitation, I just conclude this here by thanking you all, and then we will certainly engage you as we develop further, as the Angelica has put our timeline on the development of our offer. So thank you all for joining this conversation. So have a good day and the night and the weeks ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.